Hey everyone, welcome to video 4 of the Guitar Chords 101 course. In the last couple of videos we've been examining note intervals, and we've looked at all the intervals in a 12 fret span on a single string of the guitar. Then we took those same intervals and looked at them in standard notation. And in this video we're going to look at a little more practical way of playing the intervals by studying them across multiple strings of the guitar. This is going to be a lot of information thrown at you here at once, so if you're unfamiliar with much of this, don't expect to memorize all this anytime right away. It may take a while, maybe weeks, to get these intervals memorized. Okay, so here's the fretboard, and we're going to be looking at the intervals in relation to a root note on the 6th, 5th, and 4th strings, because these are the most commonly used root notes of chords. If the root is being played on the 3rd, 2nd, or 1st string, then you're more than likely playing an inverted chord, and we'll get into that topic a little bit later, but an inverted chord is one in which the lowest note played in pitch is not the root note, but some other note of the chord. So we'll start with the G note here on the 6th string. I'm just going to start by showing you all the major and perfect intervals, and then to make a note minor or diminished, just lower it by a half step, or 1 fret. I don't want to throw every single interval on this diagram because it'll be harder to make sense out of it. I think it's easier to start by learning the major and perfect intervals, than later start getting the hang of where the minor and diminished intervals are. So we'll start with the major 2nd here. Then we jump down to the 5th string, and we have the major 3rd, perfect 4th, and perfect 5th. On the 4th string we have a major 6th, major 7th, and then of course the tonic or the octave. And for the minor intervals we just lower them by 1 fret. I'm just going to flash those at you real quick here so you can get the idea of what I'm talking about. But as I said, don't worry about memorizing these too much. If you're just starting to get to know the fretboard, learn the major and perfect intervals first. And just an interesting side note that I just recently learned that a tritone is also called the devil's interval. I learned that in my studies recently, and the reason is because the note was apparently banned from being played in churches long ago, because it's the most dissonant or evil sound possible when played against that root note. Just thought that was a little interesting side note there. But anyway, since the guitar differs from the piano, and that it's sometimes possible or at best impractical to not play some sort of inversion of a chord, we must extend beyond that 1 octave and grab notes from the 2nd octave above the root note to play chord shapes on the guitar. The 3rd and 5th intervals are often played on the 2nd octave in many chords, and especially those with root notes on the 6th and 5th strings. So let's go into that 2nd octave now and look at the 2nd from the octave note. And one thing that's important to note is that when you go into the 2nd octave, these intervals actually have 2 names. For example, this 2nd is also called a 9th, and it's a 9th from the G note on the 6th string. This 3rd is also a 10th, and the 4th here can also be an 11th, the 5th can be a 12th, the 6th can be a 13th, and the 7th can be a 14th. And the tonic here would be the 15th note away from the 6th string root note, but that name is hardly ever used. And the same thing goes for the 10th, 12th, and 14th notes. They're usually just referred to as the 3rd, 5th, and 7th. But on the other hand, the 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths are commonly used names for these intervals because they're usually played as extensions to other chords. And then of course on the 6th string root, you can even go into the 3rd octave above the root and play another 2nd, or 9th, or 16th, depending on what you want to call it. But it's usually just going to be called a 9th. This is a commonly used extension in many chords, so it's important to know. Alright, so now let's look at intervals with roots on the 5th string. This would be a C note. The intervals on the 1st octave are going to be identical to the intervals where the root was on the 6th string. In other words, the positioning of the intervals is exactly the same for the 1st octave as they were with the root note on the 6th string. It gets a little different when we get into the 2nd octave down on the 2nd string. Here we have the 2nd or 9th, the 3rd or 10th, the 4th or 11th, the 5th or the 14th, and the 6th or the 13th. And then here we have the minor and diminished intervals once again, but this time I've represented them in a bit of a different way. Instead of using the terms minor or diminished, on here I've called many of the notes just simply flat or sharp. For instance, the diminished fifth, in this case, is labeled as a flat 5. The augmented fifth is labeled as a sharp 5. And the same thing with the flat 9 and the sharp 9. These are just different ways to pronounce the same notes, and they're a little more common when it comes to naming the chords with these notes in them. Okay, so now let's move down to the 4th string root intervals. And with these intervals, we're only going to go through one octave, and then up to the 4th or 11th on the 2nd octave. So here we have the root, the major 2nd, the major 3rd, the perfect 4th, and perfect 5th. And you can see the perfect 5th is played actually in 2 spots here. On the 3rd and 2nd string. You can play it either way. The major 6th, major 7th, and that's also played in 2 spots. On the 1st or 2nd string. And then we have the tonic, which is also played in 2 different spots. You can play it up higher on the fretboard, or you can play it down lower on the fretboard on string 1 or 2, but it's the same note. And then after the octave there we have the 2nd or the 9th, the 3rd or the 10th, and then the 4th or the 11th. Okay, so in this video we've covered intervals on the fretboard with root notes on the 6th, 5th, and 4th strings. We've covered a lot of material, and to help you learn this stuff, I want to encourage you to visit the quiz section of my site. Just visit that URL there, jazzguitartips.com/quizzes. I've got interval quizzes that you can take over and over again until you have this stuff memorized. And unfortunately, there's no easy way to memorize this stuff other than just looking at your fretboard and quizzing yourself on it. Another good way is I would recommend taking your guitar and just creating exercises for yourself in which you play a root note and then all the intervals, pronouncing them out loud as you play. Play them at the same time so you know how the notes sound together. And this will help it sink into your brain in the long term. So in the next video, I'm going to get into chord formulas, and this is where we're going to be able to start applying what we've learned from these intervals and actually start being able to build chords. So it's going to get a little more fun in the next video. So I look forward to talking to you guys then. Thanks for